Welcome, everyone. The Cuban Cultural Center of New York continues to pursue its mission of fostering new developments in the arts. Today, we are proud to present The High Ones, a most innovative novel by Robert Scheiga, a very talented author who is breaking new ground in the literary scene. To introduce Robert and delve into his book, we are very lucky to have the award winning critic Andrea O'Reilly Herrera, a key contributor to our literature program. Andrea is professor of literature at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, and she's also a published poet and novelist, as well as the author of a number of critical works, including the highly acclaimed Remembering Cuba, Legacy of a Diaspora, and Cuba, Idea of a Nation Displaced, to name just a couple. Please join me in welcoming Andrea O'Reilly Herrera.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for what I am positive is going to be a wonderful conversation with Rob Scheiga. I want to also begin by thanking Iraida for all that she does at the Cuban Cultural Center of New York. I am delighted to be part of this conversation. As most of you know, the Cuban Cultural Center of New York hosts a literature program, and I am positive this is going to be a wonderful conversation. So I'd like to welcome Rob and thank you for your time, for allowing us, to have a conversation with you about your wonderful novel. As all of you know, Rob is the author of The High Ones, and that is not his only piece of literature. It's a piece of historical fiction, a novel about a group of Neanderthals and their first contact with modern day humans. The novel is set 45,000 years ago, which is quite a feat, Rob, in a forgotten world unrecognizable from our own. It is based on years of research into Neanderthals and their way of life. So I have a couple of questions. Rob and I have had several conversations about the novel. And so the questions that I'm going to put forward will give you some kind of idea of what Rob's process is and how he came to the subject matter, et cetera, et cetera. I will also leave some time at the end so that when the audience signs in, Iraida will give you a link that you will be able to actually ask Rob some questions for yourself. So thank you once again for being present with us today. Very excited about this event. So I'd like to just begin, Rob, by just asking you some general questions. As a creative writer, other writers are always very interested in your process and and also how you came to this subject matter. But I'd like you to kind of share with the audience, your trajectory as a writer. You shared with me that you began writing very young. And one of the things I shared with you when we had the opportunity to converse is that a long time ago, somebody said to me that every generation has its storytellers, and that you either choose to carry the burden and the blessing of the storyteller or not, and you obviously have. So if you could share with the audience just some insights into your own career as a writer and what your process is. How would you articulate that process for us?
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for doing this, Andrea, and for everyone at the Cuban Cultural Center for organizing this. It means a lot for me as a early stage writer to have such interest in one of my work. So I thank everyone involved for putting it together, and also who are joining us today and taking an interest in it. So, I've been writing since I was a little kid. I wrote a couple of, I'd say, novels with air quotes when I was, 10, 12 years old. They're really more like long short stories or maybe novellas. But, I dabbled in poetry a bit also when I was in college. But I think maybe from a broader perspective, I've always been sort of consumed by one form of art or another, whether it's, music or dancing or film, or in the current stage, writing is what I'm focused on. And when I'm focused on something, I tend to be very focused on it. And right now what I'm focused on is writing. The High Ones actually is my second book, which you alluded to. The first was Benjamin, which I published in 2015. That was a novella. The High Ones is my first full novel. And I'm actually currently working on, I should say, editing my my second novel called The Ubiquitous They, which is I guess it's a science fiction novel that takes place simultaneously in modern day and post-apocalyptic America. So it's sometimes writing, I feel like I was taking on a bit more than I could chew, but it's a work in process. About the writing process itself, right? So it's different for everyone, right? For me in particular, I guess it comes with the inspiration, right? You get a seed of idea in your head, and that idea blossoms, and it's sort of up to you to cultivate it. And if it's a good idea, it'll cultivate in strong ways. So the idea pops in your head, you think about it some more, and usually it'll be simmering there for a while. And you take notes as you go along. Sometimes the notes are good ideas, sometimes they aren't, and sometimes just the act of writing down the notes commits it to memory better. And when you see them all together, you can maybe see connections between the otherwise disparate ideas that you might not have realized had you not sort of been seeing it. That's at least the process that works for me. As far as the writing process itself, right? Once you sort of get going, let's say, you've let the idea germinate in your mind, and you've sort of fostered it and worked on it in your head. For the writing itself, it's been said there's two types of novelists, right? There's the planner and the gardener. The planner is someone who outlines, and they outline the characters, the plot, even maybe on a scene by scene basis, and they sort of stick to that outline. All right, that's a planner. A gardener, on the other hand, is someone who starts with an idea and then writes the story from there and just sort of sees what happens. They sort of learn the story themselves as it goes along. A famous gardener that everyone's heard of is Stephen King, right? So he says when he starts a novel, he puts an interesting character in an interesting situation, and he sees what they do. And the novel's there. He just sort of takes it from the cloud, and he commits it to writing. So he has no idea about the story, where it's going when he starts it off. For me in particular, I'm somewhere in between the two. I'd say I'm more of an outliner, but I don't disregard, I guess, gardener tendencies. So I'm in the middle between the two. My process to start, once I have the seed down, I start with maybe the key points, the tentpole scenes. I write an outline around it. The characters, what they do, where they go, and how they end up. I always know what the end is going to be before I start writing. And I think for some reason, I guess, or one of the reasons I do that is maybe it's because I'm afraid of writing myself into the corner. And if I know where the story's going, I know, if I don't know exactly how I'm going to get there, I know what the end destination is. But the reason I say, despite all that I'm also a bit of a gardener is because sometimes when you're writing the story takes control of itself, right? So when I was writing the High Ones, for example, I started with an outline of characters and who's who, what the relationships are to one another, what pressures they face, what motivations they have. So I wrote a general outline, scene by scene, about what happens plot-wise, right? And how characters get from point A to point B. So that makes me more of a planner. But I'm more of a gardener at the same time, because sometimes you write the scene and it goes in a different direction. And I think it's important to let it flow and see what happens and let the story take you where it takes you. And sometimes, actually oftentimes I might say, the story ends up going into a direction that's improved from what you had originally anticipated. There's several segments in the High Ones where this happens, and it tends to happen during the writing process more in writing dialogue than in, say, exposition or descriptions of setting or anything like that. Sometimes the dialogue just goes in a place that you didn't expect it to go. And I think it's important to not be dogmatic about having an outline, or not be dogmatic about following an outline, because then you might omit sometimes what are the best scenes in the novel. So I think some of the best scenes in the novel where there's heightened tension and climactic scenes, those were derived from places where I was not dogmatic about the outline, and I just sort of let the story go wherever it tends to go naturally. And I think it also ends up with a more natural story from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, some people would say that the characters have a life of their own and that they begin to tell you what direction to go. And I wondered if you would share briefly, you mentioned to me when we were speaking that even in terms of determining the point of view and the perspective of the characters shifted for you as you were writing the novel. And I wonder if you would speak to that a bit.
Yeah, sure. So the novel's written in third person limited, right? So it's from a third person perspective, but it's from the perspective of a particular writer or a particular character, I should say. So the original idea was that it was going to be written in first person from one particular character's point of view. And I wrestled with it and wrestled with it and wrestled with it. And there were too many scenes with important plot points that needed to take place with the main character that was supposed to be the point of view character off screen. And it just wasn't working out. So I then changed my strategy to do a third person limited perspective, which jumped from one character to another's perspective. And this way you see the story from multiple points of view, right? I mean, you don't see individual scenes from multiple points of view, but every scene is from a different point of view. And I think it helps also keep the reader involved because you're seeing different characters see things in different ways, and they see each other in different ways. So there's one character that doesn't like another character, right? So you see his point of view, and then in another chapter you see how that character deals with the fact that he knows that he's disliked by this other guy. So it enables I think the fomentation of different perspectives, right? And actually, the current novel that I'm working on, The Ubiquitous They, I took that a step up, and I wrote the whole book is written from 6 or so different viewpoints of different characters, and they're all first person. So you're seeing their actual thoughts as they come to mind, and that's kind of a fun way to do it, I think.
Yeah, that's excellent. And that leads me into the next set of questions I'd like to ask you. I mean, I would assume for folks who have read the book, or even those who have not and have read the description, that they'd be very curious about how you came upon this subject matter. What inspired you? Tell us a little bit about your research process, and then, of course, the vehicle is fiction, so you have poetic license with fiction. But what are the kinds of strategies you employed to navigate telling the story you wish to tell, but also mediating historical accuracy? And, of course, with the history of Neanderthals, there are many silences in that history, in terms of what we actually do know. And so what kind of creative license did you take? And I know what some of those things are, obviously, from having read it. And I'm very interested, particularly in your use of language. For those of you who have read the novel, you know that this world comes to life with the language. It's poetic narrative. And there are these burning images that I have from the novel where you were actually able to not, to make this world palpable through the language, and also to figure out how to give voice to these characters, when we would not know what exactly was the language that they spoke and how they would speak. But you create this world, and of course it's your interpretation of this world. But I wonder if you could kind of approach those different questions, which include the setting that you created,
Yeah.
bringing that world alive for the reader.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for the compliment, right? So it took about 5 years to write this, and it was very, very hard to do. One of the reasons because I spent so much time editing it, right? And most of that editing was more wordsmithing and wordcraft than really adding scenes or doing anything more fundamental to the book. And I think part of it is because I love language, and I probably spend maybe an unhealthy amount of time working on things like sentence structure and careful use of adjectives and word choice and that kind of thing. My novels tend to have dark subject matter, but my goal is to make, I guess, the darkness sound beautiful while you're reading it, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
I guess for the novel's premise, right? So you asked sort of how the idea came to me, right? So I guess I've always been fascinated in Neanderthals, who, you know, most people who are listening probably know this. They're separate species from modern humans, right? But they're close enough genetically to modern humans to to procreate with them, and their genes actually live on, particularly in Europeans today. I think it's interesting to think of a time when there were multiple different species of humans walking around on the earth, not unlike how there are multiple species of bears or canines today, right? I mean, you can have a grizzly bear and a polar bear procreate. You can have the same thing with a wolf and a coyote, right? So it was the same thing 50 to 100,000 years ago with Neanderthals and humans. And, you know, they weren't the only ones. There were others called Denisovans. There was Homo erectus was around back then. So there's all sorts of different species of humans walking around the earth at the same time. And to me, that's fascinating. I think that's also something that not a lot of people really appreciate, right? People know about evolution of humans, but they're not aware that there was this kind of branching out and, I guess, the sort of narrowing of the gene flow into what's today modern humans. And I also thought it was fascinating how Neanderthals went extinct, and it's one of history's great mysteries, how they went extinct or why they went extinct. And although there's multiple theories about why that is, the starring role in all of these theories is modern humans, because Neanderthals did happen to disappear right around the time that humans showed up in their geographical range, right? But, you know, theories range from genocide to being out-hunted by humans to just undergoing a demographic crisis in terms of just their numbers when the last ice age started, or one of the last ice age started. And then they just were sort of outcompeted or sort of outbred by humans. You know, there's also parasites and disease, all sorts of other theories as to why they went extinct. Those last, we don't have any really empirical evidence, just ideas. So the premise itself for the highlights, right? So I was reading an article in National Geographic that said, archaeologists reveal Stone Age weapons industry with staggering output. And the article went on to discuss how obsidian weapons, and obsidian, of course, is volcanic glass, right? And it's used for tools in hunter-gatherer societies. How obsidian weapons, mostly spear tips, were found in a range from Greece to Ukraine. And they all came from the same source. And the scientists can determine that via chemical analysis of the obsidian, right? So they can not only tell that it came from the same volcano in present-day Armenia, but they can even tell you which lava tube the obsidian came from. So according to the article, I say this because I'm not so sure about these numbers, but according to the article, there were millions of these weapons found across that geographical range, all stemming from the same volcano, extinct volcano. And while even if I question the number of millions, because the number of archaeological evidence and tools and weapons that have been found, I think, is orders of magnitude smaller than that. But even if it is orders of magnitude smaller than that, that's still a huge number of these things that have been found. And that volcano, the mining, so to speak, of that volcano, was in a period of hundreds of thousands of years ago, when humans were not in the area, but Neanderthals were, and even Homo erectus was as well. So I guess the implication here is that humans weren't responsible for that trading network. And I just thought it was fascinating that there was this trading network of weapons, really, that was around the production of these mines in a period that we never thought that such a trading network could have existed. So that was the premise around which I built the book, right? And that there was one group of Neanderthals, what I chose to write about, that there was a group of Neanderthals controlling this mine, and they used their exclusive access to this obsidian to subjugate the neighboring tribes through trade and other things. And I thought it would be an interesting idea to juxtapose that concept with the concept of a first contact between humans and Neanderthals.
Yeah, and yeah, it's fascinating. And I know, and many of the folks in the audience know this, that you talk a little bit more about this process and how you kind of navigated, historical accuracy, with what we do know, with what you needed to bring into the story. For example, the domestication of wolves, so, and I would like to ask you just to add a little bit, because the language is so clever. I know when we first spoke, I mentioned to you that it reminded me of the manner in which indigenous peoples have been so in tune with the natural world, that a lot of the naming and the language reflects that relationship. And I think to a large degree you do that as well. Like, there's so many words that you've kind of invented in there that are so in tune, and resonate in that sense, almost like automatopoeia or something. So for example, calling the arrows sorrows, I just love that. So I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about how you came up with this language that would somehow approach what you believe may have been the way people would have communicated.
Sure. So yeah, I think, as I mentioned before, writing this novel was extremely hard. And one of the reasons was because of the setting itself, right? So the setting had to be a character itself, not just in terms of the plot, but also the descriptions of the setting and the environment, and the language that's used, right? So the language and word choice had to fit the setting. And I think this was most prominent in the dialogue, but also in the descriptions of the settings. For example, you take the reader out of time period, so to speak, if you use common day metaphors or similes, right? It reduced me as a writer from my arsenal, right? I can't count the times where I wanted to have a character say okay, but I'm like, no, they would not say okay. They'd say all right, or something else altogether. And I think it felt in some ways like I was writing a book with one arm tied behind my back, because there were so much things that I couldn't use and couldn't write into the story. But at the same way, on the same angle, it gave me an impetus to come up with interesting ways to describe things that I otherwise might never have come up with. One character, for example, is talking about a tall cliff that he's walking by, and he describes it as being many trees tall, right? That's something I never would have used in a novel had it not required that kind of treatment of language. So I'd say, in an interesting way, the setting held me back in some ways, but it also inspired a different kind of creativity because of the narrow scope in which I had to maneuver, right? You mentioned some of the terminology and nomenclature that I used throughout the novel. And again, this was done for the purpose of bringing readers more into the story, right? It needed to feel authentic. It needed to feel real. It needed to feel like you were there, right? So yeah, the novel's written in English, so the characters speak in English. Obviously, the Neanderthals did not speak English, right? I'm pretty sure we all agree about that. So what I did to make it feel more authentic is I substituted common day words that sort of everyone would know with words that I made up, but were made up in a way that the reader would automatically know what they meant. So for example, they call their village the living place. They call wolves howlers, and they call death the forever sleep. I think to me, it sounded almost more primitive to call them things like that, while still sort of respecting the fact that these were people with cognitive levels that were probably equal to our own today. And so they would have had, I guess, strong, well-formed ideas about what these things were, even if they called them something that perhaps might sound more primitive. And again, it's not meant as a disrespect to Neanderthals, it's just to bring readers more into the story. But hopefully those made-up words made the novel seem a little bit more otherworldly, and takes the readers back to sort of that time period to feel like they're actually there with these people. So I guess the other part of your question was the need to balance historical accuracy with telling a story, right? I mean, this is not a documentary or a nonfiction book about Neanderthals, right? This is a fiction, but it needs to feel real, and it needs to be as historically accurate as possible, while still telling a compelling story and pulling the reader in the first place, and then keeping them there and wanting them to read more and wanting them to finish it and enjoy it in the process, right? So throughout writing the novel, you're trying to balance these two things. One of making it interesting, and the other is keeping it real. I always had in the back of my head the idea of this, paleontologist or archaeologist or anthropologist or whatever, reading the book and shaking their head and saying, no, 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 that's not how it happened. That couldn't happen. That's an anachronism or whatever it is. So I did a lot of research going into this book, not just before I read the book, but also while I was writing the book or while I was editing the book. And it gave me things to take to put in. It gave me ideas that maybe I need to take out, those kind of things. I actually listed the sources in the back of the book, and those sources range from articles to full-blown books that I read. I think there's maybe a dozen or so citations in the book in all. What I found when doing the research is that there's a lot of gray and blank areas about our understanding of Neanderthals, right? There's maybe an incorrect sense in a lot of people that there's innumerable archaeological sites around the world where things have been found, where fossils and things have been found. But in reality, we're talking about a handful of sites, and there's very few bones, very few tools, very few ornaments, and so on and so forth that have been found. So most of what we know about Neanderthals and any sort of pre-human species, if you will, what we know. It has to be inferred from limited data and limited empirical evidence. So you have to interpret things. You have to put the pieces of the puzzle together, and the solution could take many forms. This might be unfortunate for science, but as a writer, it gives you a little bit of more room to maneuver, right? So it's helpful in the writing having these gray areas, and these gray areas, these blank areas, gave me as an author license, I guess, to fill in the blanks, right? It gives me elbow room to maneuver. You can use those blanks, you can use those spaces to help character development, to help plot, to allow scenes to unfold perhaps in ways they otherwise might not have. So had there been more hard evidence about Neanderthals and their way of life, it may have narrowed the scope of what I was able to do as an author. And I think it's also probable that Neanderthal way of life changed many times and evolved over time, right? Because they were active for hundreds of thousands of years. Just think about the number of different human cultures that have evolved in the past few hundred years, right? So when you're talking hundreds of thousands of years, it's totally conceivable that the world that was described in the high ones could have been similar to one in which the Neanderthals actually lived. But all that being said, there are things that are definitely historical inaccuracies and anachronisms in the novel, right? So I don't want to spoil anything. I'd be careful not to, but there's I guess wolves, domesticated dogs / wolves are featured in the novel, right? This is probably about 100 or about 10, maybe 10,000 or so years off by most counts, although the jury's still out a little bit on wolf domestication, but it serves an important plot point. And also I think there's some maybe weapons that are featured that are that did not actually exist at that point in time. And because of all these things that I was balancing, I actually wrote an afterword to the book, which is in the novel itself, that I used to explain some of the judgment calls that I had to make in terms of what to include, what not to include, and how to form things in a way that made sense for the book. So I guess one of my goals in writing that was as a defense against that anthropologist saying, no, dude, that is not how it happened. You have it totally wrong. It's like, I wanted to say, yeah, dude, I know, I got it, but it's not meant to be a scholarly academic work about Neanderthals. It's just supposed to entertain you. So that's some of my thinking of balancing those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I have this discussion many times as a professor of literature, is that oftentimes people want to read fiction with historical accuracy. Yeah. And you're actually choosing fiction as a vehicle because it allows you imaginatively to explore other possibilities. And so that's a common kind of impulse that folks have, is to read it for accuracy. So I'm so happy you talked about it. And just back to this idea of language. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning the poetic kind of narrative, or the poetic elements in your narrative. It's also your descriptions are painterly, they're visual, they're palpable, and somehow you bridge this gap. I think I may have mentioned this to you. I think about Saussure, the very famous linguist, who talked about this arbitrary relationship between the language and the actual meaning of the word. However, there are words that bridge that gap. And, according to Saussure, the community, if you will, the parole has to decide that they agree on the meaning, but language is also organic. But as those of you who have read the novel know, you bridge that gap, you somehow manage through word to recreate the feeling and the meaning and connect those two things. So, for those who have not read it, I really encourage you, those who are lovers of language, to read this novel, to just appreciate that and enjoy the language. But the last thing go ahead.
I was going to say, in connection to that, sorry.
Sure, no, go ahead.
One thing that I just thought of is when, this is in terms of, I think, an overall writing process. A lot of times when I would write a scene, I'd go back and I'd think in my head of how it would play out on film. And you said it seems painterly, and I think that connects to part of what I'm saying here. I think most current novelists or writers in general are influenced by television and by film, right? That's the literature of today, realistically speaking. That's what most people watch. That's what most of the content is. It's to be seen on a screen one way or another. And I think that forms how people tell stories. It forms how people want to hear stories. And so when I would picture a scene of my book as I'm writing it, or in between times when I'm writing, I would think of how it would look on a screen. And sometimes I can sort of do it shot by shot in my head, and then I commit that to the script, and it sort of takes a life of its own in that way. And I think that sort of helps bring the reader along, because their minds, I think, are calibrated to be told the story on film. And I think it's helpful to actually exploit that as a writer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the distinct features of your process, which I know we were able to talk about it at greater length, is that you visualize it, and then in a way you're describing what you see.
Yeah.
Well, but that kind of leads me into the last kind of thoughts and questions that I have for you, and about we have about 10 minutes left. But I'd like to talk to you about not only the themes that I was kind of pulling out of the narrative as a literary critic, but also the connection to your own Cuban Jewish background. Because you've made the point to me many times, that both of those inheritances, inform your own experience, and your own process of socialization and growing up. And of course, there's shared elements in those two experiences that you grew up with, in terms of, the diaspora that we've all grown up in, you and I. And so I just want to throw out to you, and we have talked about this, I mentioned to you when we first met, I asked you if you thought there was a connection between growing up as a Cuban, a Cuban Jewish, and your story. And your first response to me was, no, you didn't see that connection. So then as a literary critic, I said to you, but here's what I was seeing when I read your work, is that these overarching themes, which are not just particular to a Jewish or a Cuban experience, but are much more universal, of displacement, of migration, the story of survival in the face of imminent extinction, okay? And how culture comes into play there, that how do you preserve and perpetuate culture? The theme of cultural cross-pollination, if you will, and intermixing and hybridity. I mean, I don't want to give away any of the plot, but all of those themes are present. And so I asked you, could not your experience growing up in the Cuban diaspora, and also what you bring with you from, the Jewish history, including the history of the Holocaust that comes with that experience, and the displacement, and the cultural threat that comes with it, and the survival. You have that on both sides of your family. And so I threw out to you the possibility, like, could this not be informed by that experience? And when we had our second conversation, you had been kind of letting that percolate, those possibilities. So I want to ask you in broader terms, to speak to that. And then we could have a whole nother conversation about how those elements in your work can apply to contemporary society. Because although you're taking us into a deep past, for me as a reader, there was cultural relevance, that it was quite contemporary and also quite specific in terms of our own cultural experiences. So there's a big fat question for you at the end of this to just try to respond to, and then we'll leave it to the audience to ask you some more questions.
Sure. It's an interesting topic, and it's an interesting question, right? I mean, you're right. When you first asked me that, my answer categorically was no. I was like, look, I see what you're trying to do. It's a stretch. This is just an idea that came into my head. It has nothing to do with anything in my background or my culture or anything like that. I took 23andMe and I do have some Neanderthal DNA, but that's sort of notwithstanding. I found that out after starting the book. But no, seriously speaking, yeah, I said no originally, and that my heritage had no influence whatsoever in the creation or ideas or anything that went into the novel or the writing of the novel itself. But as we talked about it, and I guess in particular when I sat down and gave it more thought over a couple of weeks, I guess, I realized maybe there's more to that than I originally thought, at least on a subconscious level. So as you hit on, my heritage is both Cuban and Jewish. Jewish on both sides, Cuban on one. And those are two groups of people that have experienced diasporas. My Cuban side left Cuba for the US to escape from Castro, as virtually all Cuban Americans did. And anyone even vaguely familiar with Jewish history knows that there were numerous diasporas from all sorts of parts of the world, sometimes continents apart, over thousands of years. So, and those aren't just diasporas, but also attempts at total extermination, right? So, again, I got to be careful not to spoil anything for those who haven't read the book, but these are connected to themes that are explored in the Highlands, particularly the idea of being sort of cast asunder from your home, and the concept of extermination, not just cultural extermination, but literal extermination from the perspective of a species survival level, right? So while I didn't consciously think about the connections to my ancestry while developing the novel, I think it's safe to say that the story and the premise took the shape that they did, partly because of the knowledge that I have deep down about my family and their history, both recently and going back many, many generations, and in terms of what they were subjected to by outside forces and the choices that made them make. And I guess that ties into another theme maybe of the novel, which is the presence of free will when outside forces are influencing it. And I think that's another major theme in the Highlands, particularly, I guess, in maybe a Kafkaesque sort of way, or fatalistic sort of way.
Could you talk a little bit more about that, Rob? Because you mentioned to me that you were very influenced by Kafka as a literary influence. And perhaps there are others, that you could share with us. But could you explain for the audience how that resonates for you when you say that, when you defer to Kafka?
Yeah, I don't want to sound I'm not trying to relate myself to Kafka. He was a far better writer than I am, but influenced by his ideas certainly, perhaps. But I guess Kafkaesque to me means having limited choices and limited free will because of outside forces sort of controlling things, right? And you're sort of set in ways by aspects of the world that are totally outside of your control. And that's what happens to several of the characters and the high ones. And I try to make that point not just in the events of the novel in terms of plot, but also I try to integrate that in the descriptions of the setting. So there's a scene, for example, where it talks about the shadows that one character is casting across the snow, and it says that the shadows are formed more from the shape of the snow and the impressions on the snow than by that character's form itself, right? So you're seeing the environment shape someone's shadow, which is sort of metaphorical for, you know, their body or their soul or what have you. There's also descriptions of sort of a river's course, which is dictated by the ground below it and obstacles in its course. And there's a leaf floating down the river, right? So, you know, I think it's important. It gives the novel or any piece of literature more depth when you describe the setting well, but you also integrate some of the ideas and the symbols of the book and the concepts and the themes into the way that you describe things. And I think even if a reader doesn't pick up on it on a conscious level, I think the repetition of these kinds of descriptions will resonate with them and maybe give them a deeper feeling for what the novel's trying to say, or just ways to interpret the novel. And I think it's important to leave it up to people's interpretation. You know, I'm a firm believer in not really giving too much information about what your intent was on things.
Yeah. And as you speak and say that, you know, I think about there's a kind of the epic quality of that in terms of the repetition of certain ideas, you know, and reinforcing in that particular way and the impact that has on the reader. The other piece of this, which this is a whole other conversation, is, you know I had mentioned to you during one of our conversations, you know, one of the poems I hold dearest is Keats' Grecian Urn, you know, which was inspired, it's believed, by the Elgin marbles arriving, you know, at the British Museum in England, and Keats actually seeing them. And if, for those who don't know the poem, this unknown narrator describes the different scenes, you know, on the Grecian urn. And of course, there's no writing, there's no clue, you know, the narrator kind of meditates on the idea that nobody really knows what the real story is, but the urn has traveled through time intact, and every generation brings its own meaning to reading those images, you know, those scenes, and every generation can respond to them. And it's those universal themes, you know, that we've been talking about free will, about the forces of nature, you know, and humans' relationship to the natural world, this story of survival, this story of extinction, this story of displacement and violent displacement and rupture, is a story that has become increasingly more visible and relevant to us today. And that, you know, as Keats suggests in that poem, that's what makes a work enduring, you know, that every generation can bring its perspective and they can read their own story there. And so even though I usually shy away from using the word universal, because that's a kind of loaded term, in itself, it in some sense, that's what I'm referring to. And I know we want to leave time for folks to ask you questions. And I'm sure there are other things you'd like to add to this conversation, Rob. So I'm sad to say that we're coming to the close of our own time together interviewing, but I know that the audience will have all kinds of questions, and you should have an opportunity to add, you know, some thoughts, you know, that during the course of this conversation that has come to you. But it's been a delight and an honor to have the opportunity, you know, and I'd like to also thank the Cuban Cultural Center of New York for giving me this opportunity to talk with you and to learn more about your work. It's just been absolutely delightful. So thank you so much. I know that Iraida is sending out a link for folks to join us in a live conversation. And I will be kind of monitoring the chat. So please send us your questions. And we'll have at least 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so to field some of those questions. But Rob, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for this beautiful novel. For those who haven't read it, I really encourage you to do so. And one thing, I'm looking at the image of the book, and one thing we haven't talked about is the cover of the book and the image. So perhaps we'll have an opportunity to talk about that as well. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.